cities in Britain, and I quote his findings. He says that in 2000, over half of Chicago's black population lived in tracts where they formed 95% or more of the population. Over half of the black population in tracts where they formed 95% or more of the population. Now in England and Wales, only 9% of the combined minority population lived in wards where they constituted 67 or more percent of the population. He uses this 67 because some people have developed this threshold of 66 and 80% of shares for single minorities in order to define ethnic enclaves or ghettos. So according to that, in England and Wales, 9% of the ethnic minority population, but only if you take them together as one group, would live in ethnic enclaves or ghettos. So even in the UK, where concentration is much higher than in Germany, you would be hard-pressed to find ghettos. You do find ethnic neighborhoods, but still only a minority, while in London something like a fifth, for instance, of the ethnic minority population live in ethnic neighborhoods. I have more details here, but I will skip them for now. So if residential segregation or mixing is regarded as a main basis for inter-ethnic contact, then we should say that conditions are not all that bad in Europe for interaction, and we don't see spatial segregation as being a predominant feature. Still, is the existing separateness a result of choice? Only a few hints here because research is not very good on that. There is, in a survey done in Germany, you find hints that migrants of Turkish origin, to a greater extent than, for instance, Italian immigrants, remember the guest workers were often Italians or Spanish or Greeks in Germany, they, in their choice of accommodation, take the ethnic milieu of an area into account. In a survey, a quarter of Turks said they preferred to live in an area mainly inhabited by foreigners. This question was put in a slightly stupid way. They asked about foreigners, not about co-ethnics. Only 9.5% of Italians and about 12% of former Yugoslavs and of Greeks shared this preference. But note that it's a minority for all groups. Over 60% throughout said they did not care or they preferred to live in mixed areas. For Britain, there's a study on Bradford, a major Asian populated city, showing that concentrations are a result of population growth, mainly increasing Asian populations are population growth rather than preference of people to live together, and that minority populations tend to move out of segregated areas. So all this idea of an increasing withdrawal of immigrants into, well, segregated areas or segregated lives is not backed up by the evidence here. Of course, life in poverty areas is another problem. I will not discuss this here now, but just, well, mention that this is another point we should take seriously, and the schools are again a separate problem where segregation is much higher than in the residential areas, but again I only mention this at the moment. So what about actual contact? If residential structures are the precondition for contact, to what extent does it happen? Now again, the brief message first is contact does take place for most migrants or ethnic minority members. It is not decreasing as far as we can tell. Again, here we don't see a trend towards withdrawal. Immigrants often want more contact with members of the minority population, which should remind us that contact requires two sides to want such inter-ethnic interaction. We should not only look at the immigrants when we talk about interethnic contact. Now, this is probably a bit difficult to see. I just show you survey evidence for 3 countries. Now, this is the UK. You can see if you only look at figures here, this is do you have contact with people from different ethnic groups. Socially outside work, you can see that a large majority of Black and Asian respondents, were 59% here for the Asians, say they do. The smallest percentage is always among the majority population. They're, of course, the least likely, were partly due to numbers, but then we could discuss whether this has to do with their general openness towards such contacts. So you see that contact outside of work relations does happen for my majority. This is the Netherlands, where I only had different figures. There's a problem with European comparisons that, of course, you never get uniform data. Survey evidence in particular, they ask questions differently. So here, this is more narrowly. They ask people whether their contacts are predominantly within their own group. They could still have contacts with other groups, but predominantly. And actually, this looks like less contact here. In the Netherlands, if you look at the Turks, this is here done by residential concentration. Even if they live in extremely mixed neighborhoods where there are few other Turks, 52% say that their contacts are predominantly within their own groups. Much lower here for the Surinamese and the Antilleans. These are the 4 major non-Western immigrant groups. These are the groups the Dutch mostly look at. This is Germany. Well, this is in German, but I briefly explained. This is for Turks only. The spheres in which they have contacts with Germans, you can see that this is fairly high. I mean, we're in the 70-80% range. This is in the neighborhood. This is among friends and acquaintances. It's going down for at work because they're increasingly unemployed. Yeah, but this year is astonishingly high. This is in the family. I actually can't really trust this, how more than 30% say they have contacts with Germans in their family, because the intermarriage rates are not quite that high. But this is what you get in surveys. Often you don't understand how people arrive at their answers. But well, you can do with these results, well, you can interpret them on your own. So always, well, is this a high level or is this a low level of interethnic contact? That's difficult to tell. But before, maybe I take a step back and look at those who have little contact, because they should be the problem group, or the group that may withdraw or be little connected with the majority contacts. In this survey of Turks, well, Turks is here not a nationality category. It includes nationalized German Turks. Ethnic Turks. The results showed that leisure time contacts, which is contacts that are likely to be deliberate, not just, well, created through work conditions or whatever, are rare for about 35%, which is a significant share. And looking at those with little contact, to split this up a bit more, they found that privately 16% meet Germans only a couple of times per year, and 19% next to never. 9% report no contact with Germans at all, 9%. But in, well, qualifying this, we should know that these people tend to be older, they tend to be first generation guest workers or family members. They tend to be lesser educated, they're often not employed. So language, employment, and age are surely factors that determine whether people will have their contacts mainly in the family and the narrow ethnic groups, or more broadly. Okay, I already said it's a matter of interpretation, whether you think there's a lot of interethnic contact or contact is limited. I think one shouldn't be too euphoric. I mean, this is not a picture that shows everyone is mixing. There is a certain degree of separateness, more pronounced for the South Asian minorities in Britain and for the Turkish and Moroccan populations in the Netherlands and Germany. But on the other hand, most members of minority groups interact regularly and in their leisure time with members of the ethnic majority. And important for the general debate about changing trends, we can't see a trend towards reduced contact. This is not visible in the empirical evidence. Although, on the other hand, among a certain share of immigrants, which is difficult to quantify, there may be a desire to live among co-ethnics and separate from mainstream society. I have a couple of empirical facts here. Maybe I'll leave this for the time being. You could guess that this may be among Turks in Germany, 15% who say we wish to live among co-ethnics. Again, a question for a discussion maybe, is this all right, your perfect individual right in a democratic liberal society, or does this constitute a problem for society overall? I also have a few facts and figures on intermarriage, but I think I will not go into, this is intermarriage rates in Germany, only showing the trend that it's going up quite significantly. Britain, for different groups, not quite as clear. Maybe if someone is specifically interested, we could look at this in the discussion. Now, altogether, I think there's little reason to imagine immigrants and ethnic minorities in Europe as predominantly leading separate lives or living in parallel society. There are many dimensions of integration and interaction between minorities and majority populations. To the extent that separation exists in some spheres of life, it's not necessarily a consequence of choice on the part of the minorities. We'd have to look at the different determinants of, well, housing or social interaction. Although there are probably parts of the minorities within the minorities, I should say, who prefer to live among themselves. I've already said maybe about 15% of the Turkish origin population in Germany. It's a controversial issue, whether this is all right or whether it is a problem for a democratic and liberal society. I think it is a problem if this separateness means that groups are excluded from access to core resources, if a conflict potential develops because people feel unable to communicate their needs and to take part in key decisions affecting their lives, and of course if anti-democratic movements develop in such contexts. As regards the latter, we don't have any conclusive evidence linking residential segregation or even social separateness with loyalty. All the evidence we have, although it may not be satisfactory, shows that generally loyalty or identification with British, German society altogether, support for core democratic values is quite high among minority populations. In some German surveys, I always show this to, well, some audiences, that it's often higher among Turkish Germans than among East Germans, who are far more reserved towards democracy. And definitely it's not linked with living in a segregated environment. Yeah, so hardly a systematic link between residential social segregation and loyalty with society